Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
The night settles over the silent empires, where age brings wisdom and true power survives by staying unseen. Tonight, we turn to Funzi Tieri, the old-school boss whose quiet authority, careful patience, and deep respect for tradition allowed him to rule from the shadows long after louder men had fallen. His life wasn't driven by flash or fury, but by restraint, loyalty, and decisions made slowly, always with the future in mind. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these whispered stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now lean back, breathe slow, and let the story of Funzi Tieri guide you deeper into the quiet. On a cold night near the end of his life, an old man lay awake in a hospital room high above the New York streets he had once ruled from the shadows. The hallway was quiet. The machines at his bedside clicked and hummed in a soft rhythm, like a distant train he would never catch again. Nurses passed now and then, their steps muffled on the polished floor. They glanced in, saw a frail patient with heavy eyes and gray hair, and kept walking. To them, he was just another tired face at the end of a long day. But inside that narrow bed was a man whose name had once moved truckloads of concrete, shut down construction jobs, and made tough men lower their voices. His body was weak, but his mind kept wandering back. When he closed his eyes, he did not see the white ceiling or the steel rail at his side. He saw card games in smoky clubs, crowded tenement streets, the hard faces of judges and agents, and the long wooden table where bosses met to decide who would live and who would lose everything. Only a few months earlier, he had stood in a courtroom, dressed in a suit that still fit but no longer hung with the same power. An oxygen tank waited for him in the hallway. Federal agents watched his every breath. The judge's words had fallen like slow hammer blows. Racketeering, conspiracy, extortion. Years in prison for a man already running out of time. Cameras flashed outside. Reporters called him the first head of a major crime family to be brought down by a new law with a strange name. Rico. Now in the deep of the night, with the city's noise softened by distance and glass, he had nothing left but memories. No soldiers outside the door. No envelopes of cash stacked in drawers. Only the sound of his own breathing and the quiet ache in his chest. He reached a thin hand to his side, as if to straighten a tie that wasn't there, and let his mind travel back, far back, to a village half a world away, and a boy who could not yet imagine that one day, law enforcement would call him a boss of bosses. Before he was Funzi, he was just Francesco, a small boy in a town of stone houses and narrow paths outside Rome. The early years of the 20th century were hard across Italy. The land gave only so much. Men worked the fields or took any labor they could find. Women carried water, washed clothes, and tried to stretch bread a little further each week. In the evenings, after long days, the grown-ups spoke in low tones about people leaving, cousins, neighbors, friends, sailing across the ocean to a place they called America. Francesco's father was one of those men whose back never seemed to rest. He went where there was work, came home with tired eyes and rough hands, and counted a few coins on the table while his wife watched, hoping it would be enough. They heard stories of the big city across the sea, a place where factories needed workers and streets were lined with shops. There was danger, people said, but also chances they would never find at home. After a while, the choice no longer felt like a choice at all. The boy remembered the journey in bits and pieces, the smell of packed bodies on a ship, the sound of waves slapping metal, his mother gripping his arm when the ocean rose and fell, afraid he would lose his balance and vanish into the crowd. The cold air of the harbor when they finally reached New York, voices in many languages echoing off the stone of Ellis Island, doctors checking eyes and mouths, officials asking questions his parents struggled to answer. They ended up in a cramped apartment in a neighborhood already full of people who sounded like them. Laundry hung from windows. Children crowded the stairwells and alleys. In summer, the heat soaked the walls. In winter, wind leaked in through cracks that never quite stayed sealed. The streets were noisy from sunup to sundown, filled with pushcarts, shouting vendors, and the calls of kids chasing one another between wagons and horses. Francesco learned English word by word, the way a boxer learns to slip a punch. At home, he spoke Italian. Outside, he mixed both languages, copying older boys who had grown used to switching tongues without thinking. School was there, but it did not grab him. The classrooms were crowded, the teachers overworked, and the pull of the streets was strong. His father pushed him to attend. His mother blessed him every morning as he left. Still, more and more, his mind was on the world outside the chalkboard. On the corners, he saw a kind of power he did not see at home. Men in sharp shoes and good hats leaned against doorways, always with someone whispering in their ear. At festivals, when the saints' statues were carried through the streets, those same men walked close to the banners, dropping bills into the donation box so everyone could see. When they passed, people nodded with a mixture of fear and respect. These were not factory workers coming home with bent shoulders. They moved slow, as if the city belonged to them. Money was tight in his family. Francesco shined shoes for a while, then sold newspapers. He ran errands for shopkeepers, carried packages, swept up for a few coins. The work was honest, but the pay felt small next to what he saw some other boys pulling in, the ones who ran messages for the men in sharp suits. Rumors floated through the air like smoke, about illegal gambling in back rooms, about insurance paid by frightened shop owners, about men who collected debts that had nothing to do with banks. One afternoon, when he was still a skinny teenager, an older boy from the block called to him from a stoop. The boy was only a few years older, but he already walked with the ease of someone who knew people listened when he spoke. He asked Francesco if he wanted to make a few extra dollars, more than he usually made in a whole week of selling papers. All he had to do, the boy said, was carry an envelope from one address to another, keep his mouth shut, and hand it only to the man whose name was written on it. Francesco hesitated, but not for long. The envelope was light and thick. He tucked it inside his jacket, felt its edge against his chest, and began walking. The city seemed different that day. Not just streets and buildings, but a kind of living thing with eyes everywhere. He felt watched even when no one was near. At the doorway listed on the paper, a smooth-faced man with careful hair looked him over, took the envelope without a word, and closed the door. No thanks, no questions. Later, when Francesco went back to the boy on the stoop, the promised money was waiting. From then on, the errands came more often. Sometimes he carried messages. Sometimes he picked up small packages and brought them back. He did not ask questions, and no one offered answers. But he listened and he watched. He noticed the way certain men always seemed relaxed, never worried about next week's rent. He saw which shopkeepers hurried to greet them and which ones looked down, their mouths tight. He heard the warnings whispered by parents. Stay away from those people. They bring trouble. They bring the police. As the years passed, the United States launched itself into a strange experiment. Alcohol became illegal. For many families, it meant less open drinking, fewer loud saloons on corners. For the underworld, it opened wide doors. Suddenly, there was demand for something that could no longer be bought in regular bars. Someone had to bring in the bottles, guard the trucks, protect the hidden rooms where people still wanted to drink. For young men like Francesco, the streets grew busier after dark. He began working nights, first as a lookout. His job was simple: stand at one end of the block near a certain basement door. If a patrol car turned the corner, give a low whistle and tap twice on a pipe. Inside those basements, people did not pray or sleep. They drank, played cards, made deals. The operations were usually quiet and careful, but every now and then there were sudden shouts and quick exits when word spread that the police were close. Standing there in the shadows, cold seeping through his shoes, Francesco had plenty of time to think. He saw how quickly money moved. He watched men who had never finished school count stacks of bills, talk about shipments, complain about politicians. He saw how fear worked more effectively than any contract. If someone owed money and delayed too long, he did not receive a letter from a bank. He received a visit from men who did not need to raise their voices to make their point. Already he was starting to change. The shy boy who once kept his head down had learned to keep his face calm and his eyes open. He grew used to silence, to keeping what he knew locked inside. He learned the unwritten rules. You never talked to the police about anyone's business. You never mentioned names when you could use nods or nicknames. You did not brag. You did not draw attention to yourself unless you wanted it for a purpose. Older figures noticed. In the Italian neighborhoods, power did not belong to one man alone, but was shared among groups that would later be known as families. Back then, they were clusters of tough, disciplined gangs with links stretching from the docks to the tenements. Francesco began running into the same faces over and over. A quiet man who oversaw gambling in a few blocks, another who handled loans, another who seemed to know at once when anyone new tried to do business without permission. Little by little, his tasks grew more serious. Someone handed him a notebook filled with numbers and names, and he was sent to collect weekly payments. Some of it was gambling debt. Some of it was protection, money from store owners who knew that paying was easier than waiting to see what might happen to their windows or their delivery trucks. Francesco never shouted. He did not need to. He had the weight of unseen men behind him. When people hesitated, he reminded them who he answered to, using first names that made them stiffen and reach for their wallets. With more responsibility came more money. He started bringing cash home in amounts that surprised his parents. He did not explain where it came from. His father suspected and did not like it. Arguments sparked, soft at first, sharper over time. The older man wanted his son to avoid the life he saw growing in the alleys. Francesco replied that he was helping with the rent, with food, with clothes. His mother, caught between them, tried to calm both, grateful for the extra money, but afraid of the quiet hardness she saw settling into her boy's eyes. He was not alone. All around him, young men from poor families were making similar choices. Some found steady work in factories or on the docks, hopping to earn more as the years went by. Others, like Francesco, drifted deeper into the unofficial world that operated parallel to the one the newspapers wrote about. At first, he told himself it was only for a while, just until he had enough saved to open a little business, maybe a shop of his own. But the easy cash, the respect on the street, the way people stepped aside when he walked, those things were difficult to give up. By his 20s, he was no longer just Francesco. People had begun to call him by a shortened, affectionate nickname in Italian that eventually slid into Funzi on American tongues. In that world, a nickname meant something. It turned a face in the crowd into a figure others recognized, talked about, and sometimes feared. He was not at the top by any stretch. There were still many layers above him, capable men who had survived wars between gangs, survived prison, survived changes in leadership. But he was climbing, and he knew it. Law enforcement also began to notice him, though at first only as a name among many in their thick folders. Now and then, he was picked up in sweeps when officers raided back rooms and street corners. Sometimes he was charged with gambling-related offenses or minor violations, the kinds of things that brought fines or short stays behind bars. When questioned, he kept his answers simple, never giving more detail than necessary. Over time, detectives learned he was loyal, tight-lipped, and connected to more important figures whose names they were still trying to fit together like pieces in a puzzle. In those early years, the crimes he took part in were mostly the sort that rarely made front-page headlines. Illegal card games, numbers operations, loan collecting, quiet pressure on small businesses. They were not as dramatic as the stories told in cheap novels, but they were steady, and they formed the backbone of the Underworld's income. Each bet placed, each interest payment made by a frightened borrower, each envelope handed over in the back of a store. These were the small transactions that built fortunes and tightened control over entire neighborhoods. What he could not yet see was how these daily acts, repeated over years, would build a picture in the eyes of investigators. To him, each task was one more step in a life he had chosen almost without realizing it. A life that felt natural in a city where so many doors had been closed to families like his. Yes, there was risk. Yes, there were nights when he went home later than he liked, uneasy after hearing about someone beaten or killed for stepping out of line. Still, he told himself, this was just the way things worked in his world. Far away from his childhood village, in the crowded side streets of New York, Francesco had become Frank "Funzi" Tieri, a trusted earner in a growing crime organization. The boy who once watched sharp-dressed men from a distance now sat at small tables with them, listened to their plans, and carried out their orders. The choices he made during those years, who to help, who to pressure, who to stay close to, would shape the rest of his life, leading him step by step toward a place at the top, and eventually toward the night when he would lie awake in a hospital bed, thinking about how it had all begun. Years slid by, and the boy who once carried envelopes between strangers grew into a man who rarely had to move fast anymore. Others rushed around him. He just sat, watched, and gave quiet instructions. The city changed in front of his eyes, new buildings, new laws, new enemies. Yet beneath the surface, certain patterns remained the same. There were always people who wanted easy money. There were always debts that someone had to collect. And there were always men willing to stand between the law and the street, taking their piece from both sides. When the government finally gave up and ended the long, dry years of alcohol bans, many people believed the underworld would shrink. Legitimate bars reopened. Distilleries went back to printing labels instead of hiding in barns. But for men like Frank Tieri, that moment did not mean retirement. It meant adjustment. The same clever people who had moved liquor through the city warehouses and back alleys just shifted their attention. If one fountain of money dried up, someone would find another. Frank had proven himself during the drinking bans. Reliable, steady, never reckless. He did not disappear with the cash. He did not start fights in public. Older figures in the Luciano family, what would later be called the Genovese organization, began using him in more delicate places. There were hidden dice games to supervise, networks of illegal betting on sports, underground lotteries in poor neighborhoods where people wagered small coins on numbers drawn from rigged systems. These operations needed watchers who could count, remember, and keep cool when gamblers complained or officers came knocking. His responsibilities expanded beyond standing in doorways or passing envelopes. He managed collections for certain crews, not only money from card tables, but also payments from merchants who had been persuaded it was safer to pay a little each week than it was to face unpredictable accidents. A broken window here, a delivery truck that suddenly never arrived, a small fire in a back room. These things almost never happened by chance. The message reached those who needed to hear it. When they agreed to cooperate, things settled down. When they forgot, someone like Frank knocked on the door and reminded them. None of this involved loud drama. It was business, carried out in low voices in cafes and smoky rooms. A baker fell behind on protection money because his oven had broken and repairs were expensive. Frank sat with him at a table sticky with spilled coffee and listened. Then he made an offer. The baker could borrow what he needed from one of the organization's lenders. The interest would be heavy, but the cash would come quickly. If the man kept up, nothing worse would happen. If he did not, he would learn that these were not debts a person could escape by simply closing a shop and moving away. This kind of activity, extortion masked as security, high-interest underground lending, a web of secret wagers, became the core of his life. Police records from later years listed arrest after arrest tying his name to gambling operations and quiet threats against reluctant payers. Most cases collapsed when witnesses backed out or somehow forgot what they had previously said. A handful led to fines or short stays in local jails. None of them broke him. Each time he came home, a little more experienced, a little more respected in his world. There was a moment, sometime in the mid-1930s, when he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Until then, he had been an earner, a helpful worker with friends in important places. Then, one night in a back room glowing with the dull shine of cheap brass lamps, he was brought into the deeper circle. No one wrote down what happened there. The details lived only in quiet memories of the men present. But from that night forward, he was no longer just an associate. He belonged to the family in a formal sense, bound by rules and expectations that went beyond ordinary loyalty. Being recognized as a formal member opened new channels. Now he had a direct captain to answer to and younger men to guide. He oversaw small crews that collected debts, safeguarded betting spots, and handled money for higher-ranking leaders. His name carried more weight in discussions about which businesses could operate in which neighborhoods. He had a say in who received backing for new ventures, legal or illegal. He was still far from the top. Bosses and consiglieri made decisions above him. But his voice mattered more than it had before. Outside the underworld, storms gathered. The Great Depression left many families struggling. Factories closed, banks failed, and honest work became hard to find. In that climate, the quiet economy run by crime families thrived. People who would never have bet on a baseball game before suddenly hoped a small win in the numbers racket might cover rent. Desperate shopkeepers accepted protection from tough visitors because no bank would lend to them. Each of these situations added bricks to the structure supporting men like Frank. World War II further shook the country. Young men from every neighborhood were drafted and sent overseas. Some never returned. At home, wartime shortages and government contracts brought new chances for profit and manipulation. Dockyards boomed with military cargo. Unions grew stronger, and with them came opportunities for corruption. In several major ports and industrial areas, the line between labor leadership and organized crime blurred. It was in this environment that Frank slowly turned his gaze from individual shops and card rooms to larger systems. Trucking routes, warehouses, building trades. He had a talent for understanding where pressure could be applied. Rather than focus only on storefronts, he began paying attention to who moved goods, who could shut down a worksite with a strike, who controlled which union. If a construction company wanted a smooth project, no picket lines, no lost shipments, no sudden equipment theft, someone like Frank could make sure of that. For a fee, of course. This was extortion on a broader scale, wrapped in the language of labor peace. Investigators later described a pattern. A contractor would win a big job, perhaps a high-rise or a public building. Soon after, he would receive visitors hinting that certain unions might become difficult unless the builder cooperated. Cooperation might involve hearing particular subcontractors favored by the family, purchasing supplies from connected companies, or paying regular sums to ensure that delivery trucks passed unbothered. If the builder resisted, problems appeared. Work slowed. Threats grew less polite. Over time, most chose to go along. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Frank had become known within his organization as a calm, calculating figure. He avoided public displays. Unlike some gangsters who flashed jewelry and shouted in restaurants, he usually kept a low profile. That habit served him well as law enforcement began paying renewed attention to organized crime. National hearings, televised for the first time, introduced average Americans to the idea of a nationwide network of Italian-American criminal families. Senators and reporters spoke about the Mafia in ways that once would have been unthinkable. Frank did not testify at those headline-grabbing hearings, but his name appeared in the thick folders researchers compiled. Detectives on both local and federal payrolls pieced together bits of information. His role in illegal betting across parts of New York, his reputation as a trusted representative of the Genovese group in disputes over territory or profit sharing, his links to labor extortion. They suspected involvement in ordering or approving acts of violence meant to keep rackets safe. However, these suspicions rarely translated into convictions. Witnesses stayed silent. Insiders who might have spoken out chose their own survival instead. Inside the family, the years brought shifts in power. Legendary bosses rose, dominated, were jailed or pushed aside, and sometimes died behind bars. Names at the top of the chart changed. Luciano, then Genovese, and others after them. Each transition created uncertainty. Policymakers clamped down after notorious events. Internal struggles flared as ambitious men tried to move up. Through those turbulent periods, Frank survived. He was not the most charismatic figure. He did not control flashy rackets like drug trafficking that drew fast money and faster funerals. Instead, he concentrated on traditional sources of income: gambling, lending, union manipulation, and intimidation of businesses. That conservative approach may have helped him endure. Men who plunged into narcotics trafficking often became targets for both rival gangs and federal prosecutors. Frank tended to stick with ventures that, while obviously illegal, were, at least in his mind, less likely to bring a sudden, devastating crackdown. Of course, that did not mean he avoided violence entirely. Within the structure he served, physical force remained an accepted tool. According to later court statements and law enforcement briefs, he had a say in how and when that tool was used. If someone owed large sums and openly defied collection efforts, if a bookmaker tried to set up shop without paying tribute, if a potential witness posed too much danger, higher-ups consulted experienced figures like him about how to respond. Details of specific incidents were often lost, hidden, or never fully proven. People vanished, moved away, or suddenly changed their minds about what they had seen. Opponents sometimes suffered beatings that kept them quiet without drawing enough attention to trigger serious investigations. The message was clear: crossing the network that paid Frank was not wise. Yet in public, he often appeared polite, even grandfatherly as he aged, sitting outside social clubs, greeting neighbors, and chatting in the soft Italian of his youth. As the 1950s advanced, government efforts to understand the true scope of organized crime intensified. Undercover operations grew more sophisticated. Wiretaps captured fragments of conversations. Names that once floated only in whispered stories began appearing in official reports. The realization that many separate city gangs were actually part of interconnected families shook traditional law enforcement. They were no longer dealing with isolated thugs, but with a structure that had its own hierarchy, its own internal rules, and its own method for settling disagreements. One event in upstate New York, where dozens of underworld figures lined up for what they thought would be a private gathering, exploded into national headlines when police raided the property. Pictures of well-dressed men fleeing through the woods filled newspapers. Even if Frank did not attend that particular meeting, he certainly felt the effects. Pressure on known associates spiked. Officers began watching social clubs and restaurants more closely. Lists of suspected leaders circulated among agencies. Within that climate, caution became even more important. Frank adapted. He shifted some of his routine meetings from crowded public hangouts to quieter venues. Conversations grew shorter and less specific. Where once names and figures might have been spoken aloud, now they were implied with gestures or vague references. He trusted only a small inner set of colleagues. Younger soldiers eager to prove themselves were kept at arm's length until they had shown they understood the importance of silence. By now he was solidly middle-aged, no longer the quick-moving youth he once had been. Gray began to thread through his hair. His health, worn by smoking, stress, and late nights, showed signs of wear. Still, his influence within the family continued to climb. Experienced bosses appreciated his ability to handle problems quietly. If there was a dispute between two crews over who controlled a lucrative card room or a truck route, he could step in as a mediator. His word carried weight, and he rarely lost his temper. Meanwhile, law enforcement slowly reoriented its approach. For decades, prosecutors had focused on catching individual criminals in the act, raiding a gambling den, seizing illegal goods, arresting bookmakers. But as they understood more about the top-down nature of the crime families, they wanted to reach the people who orchestrated these operations, not just the workers on the ground. Large investigations began to target leadership figures, aiming to prove that they directed patterns of racketeering activity spanning many different illegal acts. This evolving landscape, Frank's steady rise put him under a spotlight he could not fully avoid. Detectives noted how often his name appeared when they examined labor disputes with suspicious overtones, mysterious changes in union leadership, or sudden settlements between rival construction companies. Reports from informants, men inside or near the organization who quietly passed information to authorities, described him as a figure who sat close to the command center of the Genovese family. Those informants claimed he oversaw or at least approved extortion schemes tied to certain building trades, especially segments of the concrete and construction industries in and around New York. According to these accounts, his associates insisted that developers and contractors cooperate with suppliers and hauling firms linked to the family, skimming profits, and gaining influence over which projects moved smoothly and which stalled. For businessmen caught in that net, the choice often looked like this: pay off mob representatives and guarantee labor peace, or resist and risk walkouts, vandalism, and never-ending delays. While such descriptions fueled law enforcement files, proving them in court remained difficult. The very structure of the family protected high-ranking members. Orders rarely traveled in plain language. Instead, a nod here, a phrase there, a casual remark over coffee. These carried more meaning than any written directive ever could. If violence followed, it was usually carried out by people who had never met the bosses whose wishes they were fulfilling. The years ticked on. New fads swept the country: television, rock and roll, suburban development stretching along new highways. Yet in older city neighborhoods, the same clubs, cafes, and back rooms hosted the same kinds of meetings. Frank, now a seasoned figure with decades in the circuit, found himself serving as a bridge between generations. To younger toughs, he represented the old ways, codes of conduct, respect for evolved hierarchies, a preference for making money quietly rather than chasing headlines. To elders whose health was fading, he was part of the group that would carry their methods into the future. What remained constant throughout his middle years was the kind of wrongdoing tied to his name: underground gambling in many forms, illegal lending at punishing interest, pressure on businesses and contractors, manipulation of labor unions for financial gain, and participation, direct or indirect, in violent acts meant to safeguard those activities. None of this was abstract. Families lost homes when they could not keep up with hidden book loans. Honest workers found themselves pushed aside by corrupt union officials. Small shops paid money each week that could have gone toward better equipment or more employees. Frank knew all this. Whether he felt any personal conflict about it is harder to say. He loved his own family, sent money to relatives, gave gifts at holidays. In his view, perhaps, this was simply the life available to a poor immigrant kid who had found a way to climb without a college degree or a factory boss. He might have told himself that his world had its own rules, its own sense of fairness. But outside his social clubs and kitchen tables, law enforcement agents kept adding pages to their files, determined that one day they would prove that the quiet man called Funzi was more than just a face in a doorway, that he helped steer one of the country's most powerful criminal organizations, and that he would eventually be held to account for it. In the early 1960s, the folders with his name on them no longer fit in a single drawer. In district attorney offices, in federal buildings, in police precincts, clerks slid thick files marked Tieri, Frank, onto shelves already sagging. Inside were arrest reports from decades, surveillance notes from night shifts, summaries of interviews with frightened store owners, and quiet memos from people who claimed to know how decisions were really made inside the Genovese organization. On the street, though, none of that paper showed. What people saw was an aging man with a careful walk, tailored coats, and a face that rarely betrayed emotion. He spent many mornings at small neighborhood cafes, nursing an espresso, listening more than he spoke. Younger men came and went, leaning down to murmur in his ear. He answered with brief phrases, small gestures, the tilt of a chin. To anyone passing by, it looked like old friends chatting. To investigators watching from cars across the street, it was the daily management of a criminal empire. The country around him was changing fast. John F. Kennedy was elected president, then murdered in Dallas. His brother Robert, as Attorney General, made it a personal mission to go after mob leaders. New wiretap laws, hidden microphones, and coordinated task forces replaced the old, clumsy raids of earlier years. The word Mafia, once whispered, now sputtered from television sets across living rooms. For the first time, many Americans realized that the shadowy figures mentioned in rumors were part of a national structure with rules, a board of directors, and long memories. Frank lived with that pressure, but he did not run. He had climbed too far to step away. Around him, other men were falling. Some were shot in alleys or on quiet streets after leaving restaurants. Others were marched into courtrooms, given long sentences, and sent to distant penitentiaries. He had watched this happen repeatedly since his youth. Survival meant adjusting, staying calm, picking battles with care, and never believing that the attention would simply disappear. Within the Genovese circle, the old boss, Vito Genovese, remained an influence even from behind bars until his death at the end of the 1960s. Day-to-day direction on the street shifted from one trusted figure to another. Some historians later argued that a man named Philip Lombardo quietly held the true reins while letting others appear as public heads. Whatever the precise structure, one thing became clear. Frank's importance rose as others aged, died, or were removed by courts. He had strengths that suited that era. He understood money, how to make it, how to hide it, how to turn small streams into a river. He knew unions and construction trades intimately. Even as manufacturing plants began to close in the Northeast, cities kept building, office towers, apartment blocks, government projects, highways. Every large job required cement, steel, trucking, and labor. Each of those pieces provided chances for his network to insert itself. Developers who wanted schedules kept and budgets protected quickly learned the unwritten rules. If they accepted certain subcontractors, bought concrete from certain plants, and allowed designated companies to truck material, obstacles melted away. Pickets never appeared. Teamsters delivered on time. Equipment stayed safe at night. If they resisted, problems multiplied. Slowdowns, lost paperwork, mysterious thefts. The message was delivered indirectly, sometimes by a union officer, sometimes by a soft-spoken older man over coffee, explaining that it was in everyone's interest to cooperate. This was extortion wrapped in business language. No one stuck a gun in a project manager's face in broad daylight. Instead, a mixture of real labor leverage and underworld backing created a climate where most builders saw compliance as the only realistic path. Over time, this arrangement developed into something closer to a cartel in parts of the building world, especially in concrete. Certain companies, tied to the Genovese and other families, dominated lucrative contracts. Legitimate competitors found doors closed without a clear reason. Frank did not personally show up at every site, of course. He rarely needed to raise his voice or make direct threats. He operated through channels: captains, soldiers, union figures, businessmen who lived in both the legal and illegal worlds. Yet law enforcement reports from later years repeatedly linked his name to schemes involving bid rigging, kickbacks, and systematic shakedowns of construction-related firms. Prosecutors would eventually argue that he helped oversee a pattern of racketeering that turned major public and private projects into steady sources of illegal income. At the same time, he never abandoned more traditional rackets. Illegal betting remained a foundation. Football pools, horse racing wagers, numbers games in poor neighborhoods all generated a constant flow of cash. Small-time bookmakers paid a share of their profits upward in exchange for permission to operate and protection from rivals. Anyone who tried to run an independent gambling spot without permission would soon face warnings. If those were ignored, rougher measures followed. carried out by enforcers who answered to people like Frank. Loan sharking also remained central. When banks refused credit to a small business owner or a gambler drowning in losses, a friend might suggest seeing someone connected to the Genovese circle. The loans came fast, no paperwork, no questions. In return, borrowers faced massive interest rates and relentless collection tactics. Falling behind meant more than a damaged credit score. Collectors showed up at homes or workplaces, demanding payment, hinting at physical harm or business damage if obligations were not met. Throughout the 60s and 70s, numerous FBI and police memos tied Frank to networks of such underground lenders. The state responded. Investigators placed listening devices inside social clubs and bars, bugged phones, followed couriers, and leaned on lower-level associates to cooperate. They brought him before grand juries, hoping to force testimony under oath. He refused to answer key questions, invoking constitutional protections or simply declining to speak. On at least one occasion, a federal judge held him in contempt for this silence, sending him to prison for defying the court. That stint behind bars did not break him. By then, he was an older man with a long record of short sentences and quick returns. From his cell, he passed instructions through visiting lawyers or coded conversations. Upon release, he resumed his routines with minor adjustments, aware that the circle of surveillance around him had only tightened. Meanwhile, violence continued to pulse quietly beneath the surface. High-ranking figures rarely carried out attacks themselves, but they influenced who would be targeted and when. Law enforcement agencies came to believe that Frank had a role, direct or indirect, in approving serious retaliation against people who threatened the organization's stability. Potential informants, stubborn debtors, reckless associates whose actions drew unwanted heat, or rivals who violated territorial boundaries. Very few of those incidents ever resulted in murder convictions against him. That did not mean investigators thought he was innocent of involvement. It meant that by the time a body was found or a survivor limped into an emergency room, the trail leading upward had already gone cold. Witnesses disappeared, changed their stories, or insisted they remembered nothing useful. When he was asked directly about such matters in court, he denied any connection, portraying himself as a modest businessman unfairly targeted because of his background and acquaintances. Inside the Genovese ranks, though, his stature reached its peak during the 1970s. In 1972, Tommy Ryan Ebali, who had acted as a visible head on the street, was gunned down on a Brooklyn corner. The killing created uncertainty about who would guide the family's day-to-day operations. Various accounts suggest that after this, the other New York family's leaders, collectively known as the Commission, recognized Frank as the face of Genovese power in dealings between families and with outside interests. Some researchers later argued that he served as a kind of front boss, presenting himself as the head while another, more hidden figure, quietly controlled long-term strategy. Whatever the internal arrangement, government agencies from that point forward treated him as the official head of the Genovese network. To reporters and agents alike, he was a boss of bosses figure, a man whose word could sway decisions across multiple boroughs and industries. He was in his late 60s by then, walking more slowly, sometimes relying on others to steady him. Photographs from the period show a stocky older man with heavy-lidded eyes, often dressed in conservative suits rather than flashy outfits. Neighbors saw him as a grandfatherly figure who joked with children on the block, gave out small bills on holidays, and attended family gatherings. They might have preferred not to know the details of what he discussed in back rooms after those gatherings ended. Under his watch, the Genovese organization kept focusing on what it had long done best, infiltrating legitimate industries, using union power as leverage, and milking steady rackets rather than pursuing wild, quick-profit schemes. Narcotics trafficking existed in the wider underworld, bringing rapid wealth followed by long prison terms or sudden deaths. Frank's circle, by most accounts, tried to keep a certain distance from that world, at least officially. That did not mean no one under the Genovese umbrella touched drugs. Enforcement records show plenty of cases. But as a matter of policy, top figures preferred to anchor their income in gambling, loans, labor racketeering, and business extortion, crimes less likely, in their minds, to bring entire investigative armies down upon them. They misjudged the changing legal landscape. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. This new law allowed prosecutors to treat a long-standing group as a criminal enterprise and charge leaders with directing a pattern of illegal acts, even if they had never been caught personally taking a bet or issuing a direct threat. Under RICO, being the guiding mind became as dangerous as being the hand that swung the bat or collected the debt. For a while, the new law sat mostly unused. Prosecutors were cautious, unsure how courts would interpret it. But as the decade progressed and frustrations mounted about the seeming untouchability of high-ranking mobsters, more ambitious legal teams began to experiment. They studied the structure of families, traced flows of money, compared notes from multiple investigations, and slowly assembled broader cases that covered years of extortion, bribery, and fraud. In several of those developing investigations, one name kept appearing whenever concrete, construction, and Genovese influence overlapped: Frank "Funzi" Tieri. Informants described him as a key voice in decisions about who could bid on large building jobs in certain parts of the city. Surveillance reports placed his associates at meetings where contractors allegedly agreed to fix prices, carve up territories, and secretly pay a share of their profits back to the family. Union officials who privately complained of pressure later found themselves facing subtle consequences: lost positions, denied promotions, or quiet exile to less important locals. For years, this information existed in fragments spread across different agencies and cities. Only toward the late 1970s did federal investigators begin knitting those pieces together into a single tapestry. Teams from the Justice Department's Organized Crime Unit, FBI field offices, and local prosecutors compared files, interviewed cooperating witnesses, and drafted long charts mapping out relationships, rackets, and payoff chains. Frank, going about his rituals of coffee, clubs, and quiet conferences, may not have felt the full weight of that mounting case. He had spent his life being watched. In some ways, constant surveillance felt normal. Yet this time, the attention was different. Instead of aiming for a quick arrest on a single gambling charge, investigators were building something larger: an accusation that he, as a leader, had helped direct a continuing criminal enterprise spanning gambling, loan sharking, labor corruption, and systematic intimidation of businesses. He had always believed that keeping his own hands physically distant from most crimes would shield him. If the police found a betting slip, it would be in some bookmaker's pocket, not his. If a truck was torched or a contractor threatened, the people directly involved could truthfully say they had never seen him. But RICO did not require proof that he lit any fires or wrote any threatening notes. It required proof that he belonged to, and played a role in guiding, an organization whose very purpose was to earn money through ongoing illegal activity. Through the 1970s, his health began to slip, even as his legal jeopardy grew. Years of stress, heavy eating, and smoking damaged his heart and lungs. Friends noticed he seemed more easily winded, needing to pause on short flights of stairs. He brushed off concerns, insisting he was fine, that he had weathered worse. Yet the same stubbornness that had helped him survive street wars and rivalries now faced a different kind of enemy, an intricate legal strategy designed not just to inconvenience him, but to keep him in prison for the rest of whatever life he had left. By the end of that decade, grand juries were hearing testimony about the concrete industry, union kickbacks, and meetings among bosses from several families. Prosecutors quietly drafted indictments that would, for the first time, charge a recognized New York mob leader under the RICO statute. Among the names on the draft in stark black letters was Frank Tieri, listed not simply as a participant, but as one of the central figures. He could not yet know the exact shape of what was coming, but he could feel the walls closing. Phone calls felt shorter. Visits from certain acquaintances slowed, as some men chose distance over loyalty once the temperature rose. Sleepless hours lengthened. The same city that had once seemed to open its alleys and back rooms to him now felt smaller, more tightly watched. Still, every morning he put on a suit, straightened his tie, and stepped onto the sidewalk, an aging boss moving through streets that held the memory of his entire journey, from a poor immigrant boy carrying envelopes for older kids, to a feared decision-maker whose choices could determine whether a skyscraper rose on schedule or stalled indefinitely. Ahead, waiting just beyond the bend of time, lay the case that would finally pin him down, the courtroom where all those bulging files would be opened, and the moment when his long dance with law enforcement would come to an end. The morning it finally happened, nothing looked different at first. Dawn slid in between the buildings, painting the sidewalks with a weak gray light. Delivery trucks rumbled down side streets. Shopkeepers raised metal gates, sweeping away the dust of yesterday. Inside a modest house where an old man lived with his family, the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. A television muttered softly from another room, tuned to some morning news show no one was really watching. Then came the knock. It was firm, not frantic, not a visitor. Everyone in that house knew the sound. Years before, when he was younger and quicker, Frank had heard it many times. Usually it meant a brief disruption, a trip to a station house, some questions, a lawyer's arrival, then home again in time for dinner. But this time, as he sat at the table with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, he could feel in his bones that this was different. His wife looked at him, worry carved into the lines around her eyes. He gave a small shrug, the kind a man uses when there is nothing left to say. Slowly, with the stiffness of age and long-ignored aches, he pushed himself up and walked to the door. On the front steps, a cluster of federal agents waited in their dark windbreakers, badges glinting. Behind them, unmarked sedans idled at the curb. Neighbors peered from windows, faces half hidden by curtains. A senior agent, older than most, stepped forward and read from a sheet of paper, his voice formal. An indictment returned by a federal grand jury. Charges under a law whose name still sounded strange to ears used to words like conspiracy and extortion. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. To the reporters who would later summarize it, the list of accusations sounded simple enough. They said he had helped lead a criminal enterprise that used illegal betting, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and business intimidation to squeeze money from the city's veins. They said he had a hand in controlling which companies poured concrete for big projects, which unions stayed quiet, which contractors got jobs, which bookmakers kept operating. They said he had done this not once or twice, but again and again, over years, enough to form a pattern of racketeering activity. Standing in the doorway, Frank listened without expression. Then he nodded, turned, and asked for a coat. His hands shook slightly as he slid his arms into the sleeves. One of the agents, seeing the tremor, stepped forward as if to help, then thought better of it. No handcuffs yet, not on the front steps. They walked him to the car with a kind of grim politeness. At the federal building, the usual routine unfolded. Fingerprints, photographs, forms. Only the charges were different. Instead of a single gambling count or a narrow extortion case, this stack of papers reached back over 2 decades, pulling together bits and pieces law enforcement had gathered from many separate investigations. To them, it was the culmination of a long pursuit. To him, it felt like the government was finally trying to put his entire life on trial. In the first hearing, he stood before a federal judge, flanked by lawyers in dark suits. The prosecutor read out the main points of the indictment. Involvement in illegal gambling operations stretching through multiple boroughs, supervision of underground lending at usurious rates, orchestration of threats against businessmen who refused to pay, influence over construction projects and unions, especially in the concrete and building trades. All of it threaded together and held up as evidence of a single organized criminal enterprise. His attorneys fought hard on that very idea. They argued that the new law was too broad, that it unfairly lumped together separate acts, some decades old, to paint him as a mastermind. They said he was merely a retired neighborhood figure, an aging man with bad lungs, who met friends for coffee and acted as a kind of peacekeeper sometimes when disputes arose. They called the RICO law an overreach, a tool that turned rumor into evidence and ordinary associations into enterprise. Bail became the first battle. Prosecutors insisted he be held. They said his position in the underworld made him a danger, that he could intimidate potential witnesses or continue giving orders from his home. Defense lawyers countered with medical records, test results, and doctor statements describing weak lungs, a damaged heart, and a body worn down by age. Keeping him locked up before trial, they argued, would amount to a slow punishment before any verdict had even been reached. For a time, the court allowed him out under tight conditions. He was confined mainly to his residence, forbidden from seeing certain associates, closely monitored. Even then, plainclothes agents loitered on corners near his block, noting every car that paused, every familiar face that visited. Phone lines crackled with quiet clicks no one admitted to hearing. Months later, the trial began. In a wood-paneled courtroom high above the street, a jury took their seats. The room looked like any other federal trial space: flags, seal, rows of benches, microphones, a witness stand. Yet the people who filled it knew they were living through something new. This was not a bookmaker caught with slips in his pockets. This was a man the government openly called a boss, charged under a law designed precisely to put someone like him behind bars for a very long time. When he walked in with his lawyers each morning, observers noticed how frail he seemed. He moved with care, sometimes pausing to catch his breath. An oxygen tank often sat nearby, ready if needed. The press wrote about this contrast. A man prosecutors painted as a ruthless commander appearing in court as a grandfatherly figure with watery eyes and a slow step. The government's case did not rely on one dramatic moment. Instead, it unfolded piece by piece, like a patient puzzle. Agents took the stand and described years of watching certain social clubs, following certain men, listening to tapped phone calls. Charts appeared, showing boxes with names connected by lines. At the center of several webs sat Tieri Frank, linked by testimony to gambling crews, loan collectors, union officials, and brokering roles in disputes between rival outfits. Former bookmakers came forward, some under assumed names or heavy protection. They spoke about paying a tax to operate, about being summoned to meetings where they were told how much to send up the chain. Underground lenders or borrowers who had survived their experience recounted desperate visits to back rooms when they needed cash, and the relentless pressure that followed if they fell behind. Visits at odd hours, veiled threats, the feeling that eyes watched them everywhere. Union officers, some retired, others seeking leniency in their own cases, testified that they had been leaned on to steer contracts a certain way. They described gatherings in restaurants where contractors discussed bids, always with one eye on how their choices would be received by the invisible powers behind the scenes. One former official recalled a conversation where an intermediary, said to speak for Frank's group, made it plain. If they wanted labor peace, they would adjust their hearing lists and purchasing decisions as instructed. To refuse, he implied, was to invite strikes, vandalism, or worse. No single anecdote was shocking in itself. There were no dramatic confessions of a specific order to harm one person or rob a particular bank. Instead, the prosecution kept returning to the notion of pattern. This man, they argued, had for years occupied a position in a structure whose business model was crime. Just because he did not personally throw punches or take bets at a table did not mean he was not deeply involved. Under RICO, being a directing force could be enough. Defense attorneys pushed back at every turn. They attacked witnesses as liars trying to save themselves, questioned the reliability of old memories, and suggested that any talk of the family was exaggerated folklore. They emphasized his health, his age, his modest home life. One lawyer asked a witness, "Did you ever at any time hear my client instruct anyone to commit a crime?" The man on the stand hesitated, then admitted he had not. The defense seized on that hesitation, repeating it in closing arguments. Nothing linked him directly to any specific violent act. In the gallery, reporters scribbled, judges' clerks shifted papers, and young law students watched a real-life test of a law they had studied in theory. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited each day for his arrival and departure. Sometimes he glanced toward the lenses with vague irritation. Sometimes he ignored them entirely. He never gave quotes. If questioned, he said only that he was innocent, that the government was trying to blame one man for an entire city's problems. The jury deliberated for days. Those hours stretched long for everyone involved. In his cell at the courthouse or his temporary quarters, Frank kept his routine. Early rising, quiet time, brief meetings with lawyers who tried to keep hope alive by discussing grounds for appeal even before the verdict. Yet under the surface, he must have understood that the odds were against him. The law was new, but the mood was not. Across the country, public patience with organized crime had run thin. When the jurors finally returned, the courtroom filled with a heavy silence. Faces that had become familiar over the past weeks now looked carefully neutral. The foreperson handed a stack of papers to the judge. One by one, the clerk read the decisions. Guilty on the central racketeering count. Guilty on key underlying charges involving illegal gambling, extortion, and labor-related corruption. A few lesser accusations did not stick, but the core of the case did. There was no outburst. No one leaped or shouted. Frank's shoulders sank just a fraction. He turned slightly toward his lawyers. One put a hand on his arm and whispered something meant to encourage talk of appeals, of fighting on. Guards stepped closer, not crude but present. In the press rows, pens flew across notebooks. Headlines were already forming in minds. Mob boss convicted under RICO. First major family leader nailed by new law. Sentencing came later. At that hearing, the prosecutor argued that the damage done by the enterprise he had helped lead could not be measured only in dollars. Think of the shopkeepers squeezed, the workers pushed aside, the honest contractors frozen out, the jurists said. Think of the way fear had become a quiet tax in entire neighborhoods. They asked for a punishment that would send a message not just to him, but to anyone who might consider stepping into his shoes. His attorneys, in turn, pointed again to his frailty. They said a long term would be a death sentence for a man of his age. They asked the judge to show mercy, to take into account not just the cold language of statutes, but the simple reality of an old man in declining health. They read letters from family members, mentioned grandchildren who still saw him as a kind presence at holidays. When the judge spoke, his words moved slowly, each phrase weighed. He acknowledged the defendant's age and condition, yet insisted that position in an organized crime structure carried special responsibility. Leadership, the judge said, meant being accountable not only for personal acts, but for the ongoing pattern of harm carried out under one's watch. Then he announced a substantial prison term, long enough that, given the years already etched on Frank's face, it was unlikely he would ever walk free again. Reporters wrote that he barely reacted. He stood, listened, and then allowed the marshals to lead him away. No dramatic collapse, no complaint. On the ride back to his holding facility, he looked out the window at streets he had known all his life. Crowds moved along sidewalks, unaware that the man in the transport van had once silently influenced which buildings rose above them. Doctors soon recommended moving him from a regular prison to a federal medical center, a place designed to house inmates who were seriously ill. There, routines were quieter but no less strict. Wires and tubes replaced the social club chairs and sidewalk stoops of his earlier life. The men around him were not soldiers or capos, but fellow patients, some mobsters, some not, all under guard, all counting days on a calendar that mattered in different ways to each of them. Back in New York, others stepped forward to fill the shadowed role he had occupied. Meetings took place in different restaurants, different homes, but the topics were familiar. Who would oversee which operations? How to protect rackets from fresh legal scrutiny? Which businesses could still be pressured without drawing too much attention? The machine he had helped guide did not stop when he fell. It shifted, adapted, replaced one aging part with another. Inside the medical unit, his world shrank to a small room, periodic visits from lawyers and occasional contact with close family members able to make the trip. Appeals moved slowly through the courts. Motions were filed, citing legal errors, challenging how RICO had been applied, questioning the credibility of key witnesses. Judges read briefs, held hearings, issued rulings. Nothing, however, undid the jury's core conclusion that he had been a central figure in a long-running criminal enterprise. Nights grew longer in that place. Machines whirred gently. Nurses came and went. Federal officers lingered in the hall. Sometimes late, he would close his eyes and remember the neighborhood cafe, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of voices discussing construction sites and union votes. Those times felt impossibly distant now, separated by miles of concrete and walls topped with razor wire. For decades, he had believed that distance, between himself and the actual exchange of illegal cash, between his hands and any direct violence, would protect him. In the end, that distance became the very thing the law bridged. The ideas he had spoken softly in back rooms, the nods he had given, the quiet approvals he had offered were enough. The pattern was what mattered. That was the lesson written into the judgment against him. A lesson other bosses watching from afar studied with a mix of anger and fear. As winter edged closer outside the medical center's windows, the man who had once been called a boss of bosses lay surrounded not by lieutenants and money counters, but by charts showing his heartbeat and breathing. The law he had once tried to ignore had finally reached him, not in a blast of sirens on a crowded street, but in the slow, clinical language of a federal verdict. The life he had built from the alleys of his youth to the stealthy control of unions and construction was now folded into casebooks and lectures, used to teach young prosecutors how RICO could be made to work. Somewhere in a city he knew by heart, new crews gathered in dim rooms, whispering plans. They would learn from his fate or fail to. Either way, his own path had largely been decided. His remaining days would unfold not in the noisy streets of New York, but in the quiet corridors of a guarded hospital, where the sounds outside his door were measured in footsteps and the turning of keys. In the medical center, time moved differently. There were no late-night meetings, no quick drives across bridges to calm a dispute in some back room. Days followed a fixed schedule: wake-up calls, medication rounds, checkups, bland meals at fixed hours. Guards stood at the ends of halls, weapons holstered, eyes bored but alert. The air smelled of antiseptic, not espresso and cigarette smoke. For a man who had spent his life drifting from cafe to club to restaurant, walking his own routes through the city, the narrow routine felt like a different kind of punishment. Nurses rolled carts past his door. Other patients coughed behind thin curtains. Television sets muttered in common rooms, cycling through game shows and local news that sometimes, very occasionally, still spoke his name. Lawyers visited when they could, bringing legal papers instead of food or cigars. They spread folders on the small table by his bed, talking quietly about appeals. They argued that the new racketeering law had been stretched too far. They said the jury had been overwhelmed by stories about the mob in general, instead of focusing on specific acts tied to him. They pointed to his failing health as a reason to reconsider the sentence, if not the conviction itself. Appeals were filed in higher courts. Judges examined transcripts, listened to arguments about constitutional limits, and reviewed how the trial judge had explained RICO to the jury. Prosecutors responded in long written briefs, insisting that the pattern of illegal activity was clear and that he had been fairly convicted under the statute. They reminded appellate panels that this defendant was not a random worker, but someone widely recognized by law enforcement as a leader in a powerful criminal structure. Months slipped by as those judges deliberated. In the medical wing, nothing changed visibly. He rose with help, shuffled down the hall for tests, lay back down with his breathing assisted by tubes. Sometimes he asked the lawyers about chances. They never promised success, but they did not surrender either. Legal motions kept moving through the system, even as his body slowly gave out. Outside those guarded walls, investigators continued to study the case that had put him there. The trial had laid out, in public, decades of activity that had previously existed only in rumor, police notes, or sealed grand jury rooms. Contractors described being cornered into using certain suppliers for cement or trucking if they wanted to finish big building jobs without costly delays. They spoke of secret gatherings where bids were quietly arranged in advance so that favored companies, tied to the Genovese circle, consistently landed major contracts. Underground bettors and bookmakers had told jurors about sending envelopes of cash up the chain, knowing that the money would eventually reach higher-ranking figures, including Frank. Lone victims recounted the cycle of quick cash, crushing interest, and unrelenting pressure from collectors who reminded them that walking away was not an option. Union officials described phone calls and meetings where they were advised which candidates to support in leadership elections, which contracts to approve, and which employers to lean on. The conviction did not list every single act that he or his associates had ever committed. That would have been impossible. Yet it captured the main categories that shaped his working life. Illegal gambling in many forms, high-interest underground loans, threats against businesses to extract regular payments, and manipulation of labor organizations and construction trades to steer money toward companies the family favored. In a city built on constant development, those activities touched far more people than those who ever met him in person. In the old neighborhoods, residents reacted with mixed feelings when the verdict was announced. Some took quiet satisfaction, hoping that the loss of such a senior figure would ease the pressure on their small shops. Others shrugged, convinced that if one leader fell, another would take his place. A few older people who remembered him as a young runner from the block felt a strange sadness, even if they were under no illusions about the life he had chosen. Within the Genovese network itself, the response was practical. Plans for succession did not start the day of his conviction. They had been forming for years, as his health weakened and potential prison time loomed. Long before he lay in that medical ward, other men had been taking on more responsibility. One of them, a heavy-set figure named Anthony, Fat Tony Salerno, became the public face of the family in the early 1980s in the eyes of the FBI. Law enforcement believed he had stepped into the role Frank once played. Later, turncoat testimony would suggest that yet another, more secretive man sat above Salerno, but at the time, the government saw a direct line from Tieri's fall to Salerno's rise. For prosecutors, the conviction was a proof of concept. They had shown that RICO could be used against a recognized head of a major crime family. That success energized broader efforts. In meetings in Washington and New York, federal officials talked about building cases not just against individual bosses, but against the commission itself, the board of leaders who sat above the 5 New York families and sometimes mediated disputes across the country. The trial of Frank Funzi Tieri became a reference point in those discussions, an example cited in memos and training sessions. His story, meanwhile, shrank to the size of a hospital room. Family visits became the few bright points in his weeks. His wife, older now herself, came when she could, sometimes with grown children or grandchildren trailing behind. They passed through metal detectors and long hallways before reaching his bedside. The conversations, limited by fatigue and privacy concerns, rarely touched the details of his case. They spoke instead of small things: school, holiday meals, old memories of better days. Guards stood a short distance away, listening without really listening. Occasionally, someone would mention rumors from back home, who had been promoted inside the Genovese circle, which clubs had closed, which new restaurants had become unofficial meeting spots. He listened but gave few comments, whether out of caution, exhaustion, or his own understanding that his time at the center of that world was over. He no longer tried to direct affairs from afar. Whatever influence he once held on street corners had been replaced by a different sort of presence. His name in training manuals, on conference agendas, in law courses explaining how to attack organized crime. Inside his head, the past ran on its own loop. Ellis Island, narrow tenement rooms, back alley card games, smoky clubs, hushed talks with men whose faces were now long gone from the earth. Courtrooms, too. That first sharp taste of arrest as a young man. Later hearings where his lawyers had gained dismissals or minor penalties. And finally, the long table and waiting jury that had delivered the verdict which landed him here. He had never spoken publicly about regret. Like many of his generation in that life, he held fast to a certain code. No cooperation with authorities, no open confession, no betrayal of allies. To the end, he maintained, through counsel and in any carefully monitored statement, that he was not the powerful figure the government portrayed. Yet the very structure built around him had already begun to adapt to his absence, proving that in his world, no one was truly irreplaceable. As winter turned to a damp Midwestern spring, the appeals ground to a conclusion. Courts upheld the main pieces of the judgment. They agreed that the evidence showed he had taken part in, and helped guide, a continuing pattern of criminal conduct linked to the Genovese family. They found no major errors in how the trial judge had instructed the jury about Rico. Requests for compassionate release based on illness drew sympathy in the language of rulings, but not the outcome his lawyers sought. The sentence stood. On paper, he still faced years in custody. In reality, his body did not have that much time left. In late March 1981, his condition worsened sharply. Heart problems that had nagged him for years grew critical. Fluid filled his lungs. Doctors monitored him closely, adjusting medications, increasing oxygen flow. Guards signed in and out as shifts changed, their notes mentioning nothing unusual beyond the medical updates. Outside the facility, almost no one knew how serious things had become. On March 31, 1981, he died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. Officially, the cause was heart failure, the final step in a decline sped along by age, stress, and long-standing illness. He was 77 years old. News of his death reached New York quickly. For some, it merited a brief mention on back pages. Convicted Mafia boss dies in prison hospital. For others, especially in law enforcement circles, it marked the passing of a man whose case had changed the legal landscape. The funeral, held back near his old home ground, was watched carefully. Undercover agents scanned the faces in the crowd, looking for hints about who now held power. They wrote license plate numbers, took photographs from a distance, and later tried to match names to the mourners. The service itself was quiet. Family members grieved a husband, father, grandfather. Friends from the old neighborhoods remembered a boy who had left Italy with them, a young man who had once cracked jokes on tenement steps. In the pews, men from his life in the organization sat with careful posture, aware that every move they made might be noted. They kept their conversations short, faces expressionless. Whatever decisions would be made about leadership and rackets, they would not be announced here, under the eyes of both the church and the state. Afterward, his body was laid to rest in a cemetery outside the city. A stone with his name joined countless others, marking the end of a journey that had begun in a small village across the ocean, passed through the crowded streets of immigrant New York, and wound its way to courtrooms and, finally, a hospital under federal guard. With his death, the story of his direct actions reached its end. No more orders, no more quiet approvals, no more meetings where contractors waited to hear whether they would be allowed to pour concrete on the next high rise. Yet the structures he had helped shape did not vanish overnight. Some of his schemes, especially those involving construction, unions, and gambling, continued under new managers. At the same time, His conviction and eventual death in custody stood as a warning, a visible case study that other bosses could not ignore. In the years just after he passed away, federal prosecutors pushed forward with even larger RICO cases. The so-called commission trial in the mid-'80s targeted the collective leadership of multiple New York families for precisely the sorts of conduct that had been exposed in his proceedings. Control over unions, manipulation of industries, long-running patterns of extortion. When those later cases went to court, lawyers on both sides mentioned his name. For the government, he was proof that no boss was beyond reach. For defense attorneys, he was an example they tried to distinguish their clients from, seeking to argue that each new defendant was less involved than the old man from the Tieri case. Books, documentaries, and academic studies eventually treated him as a key figure in the transition from an era when mafia leaders seemed untouchable to one in which they routinely faced extended federal sentences. They examine how his quiet, businesslike approach to crime, in gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and business intimidation, had allowed his family to grow rich without the showy violence that drew cameras. They also detailed how that very approach, spread across so many areas of city life, gave prosecutors the broad pattern they needed under RICO. For the people who had paid his collectors, who had been forced to use favored suppliers, who had lost businesses because they could not keep up with inflated loan payments, his death did not erase the past. Debts had already been collected, shops closed, families uprooted. The influence he exerted over unions had reshaped entire trades, diverting contracts and wages in ways that would echo for decades. His story, which had once unfolded in whispers, now lived on in court opinions, law school lectures, and cautionary tales told in training rooms where young agents learned how to follow money instead of only chasing individual crimes. In the neighborhoods where he had first carried envelopes as a teenager, new generations grew up with only a vague sense of who he had been. They knew the name from older relatives or glancing mentions in histories of the mob, not from seeing him lean in a doorway. What remained was a simple truth. A boy who arrived in America with little, who chose a path through back rooms and shadowed meetings, rose to a position where his nod could tilt major industries. And then, after decades of eluding decisive punishment, he became one of the first high-level bosses to feel the full weight of a law designed to dismantle the very enterprise he helped maintain. That arc from ship's deck to prison hospital, from neighborhood runner to convicted racketeer, would continue to be examined long after the man himself was gone. Years after he was gone, his story still tugged on people in different ways. In a windowless conference room in a federal building, a young trainee flipped through a thick binder with his name on the cover. It had been years since Funzi Tieri died in that prison hospital, but the agency still used his case to teach new recruits how to think about organized crime. The trainee had grown up in suburbs, far from the streets where Frank once walked. To him, the old black and white mugshots looked like shots from another world. An instructor stood at the front of the room, pointing to a projected chart on the wall. Lines ran from Frank's name to others: bookmakers, union officials, construction bosses, small-time lenders. "Remember," the instructor said, "he didn't start with all of this. He built it, piece by piece. You're not just learning a biography. You're learning how a life of crime can grow slowly until it reaches into everyday things like who pours concrete for a school or who gets hired on a job site." The trainee turned a page and found a report from the 1950s. A small item almost lost among the rest. A raid on an illegal card game. A handful of arrests, including Frank. The complaint mentioned gambling paraphernalia and cash, nothing more. Fines followed. For the young agent reading decades later, it seemed minor. But in the file, a clerk had circled one phrase in red. Subject believed to oversee local bookmakers on behalf of Genovese Group. That belief, repeated again and again in later reports, was the thread that tied his entire working life together. From the start of his serious underworld career, gambling ran through everything. In back rooms above groceries, in social clubs hidden behind tinted glass, in basements known only through word of mouth, he helped maintain a quiet system where people could wager on horses, cards, ball games, or the three-digit numbers game that wound through poor neighborhoods. The business looked simple, but behind it sat layers. At the bottom were runners taking bets and paying winners, often men with regular jobs who used this side work to make ends meet. Above them, small bookmakers kept track of wagers, adjusted odds, and tried to balance their books so they could cover winners and still send money up. If a bookie handled enough action in a territory controlled by the Genovese family, he owed a share to the higher-ups. That share moved upward in envelopes, handed off in nondescript diners or passed in cars. According to testimony and surveillance summaries, Frank became one of the key people those envelopes reached. He did not handle every bet himself. What he did, investigators said, was manage who could operate, how much they had to pay, and what would happen if they stopped paying or tried to keep more than their agreed slice. Most of the time, what would happen did not make headlines. A stubborn bookmaker might receive a warning talk. If that failed, he might be visited by 2 or 3 serious men who explained, in plain language, that continuing to defy the arrangement would end badly. If those warnings were still ignored, beatings or worse could follow, often carried out by enforcers several steps removed from Frank, but still linked back to the structure he helped oversee. Loan sharking worked in a similar layered way. People who needed money badly, small shop owners, gamblers, workers behind on rent, often found doors closed at banks. Someone would quietly suggest seeing a private lender. The terms were quick and harsh. Large interest charged weekly or monthly, late fees piling up fast. The borrower walked away with cash in hand and a knot in the stomach. When payments slowed, collectors stepped in. They didn't always start with threats. Sometimes they simply showed up often, made sure the borrower understood that hiding was impossible. If persuasion failed, more forceful methods came next. Smashed storefront glass, vandalized cars, sudden confrontations outside homes. Law enforcement files from the era link Frank's crews to several such loan networks. The names of victims change in each report, but the pattern repeats. Then there was labor racketeering, the domain that eventually made his case stand out. In theory, unions existed to protect workers, to bargain for better wages, safer conditions, fair treatment on the job. In practice, in some trades and cities, men like Frank learned that unions could also serve as powerful tools. If you could influence who led a local, you could shape which contractors got workers and which didn't. If you could sway hearing lists, you could demand payments from both employers and job seekers. Investigators later pieced together how he and his allies used this influence over certain building trades to reach deeper into the construction industry. It started with quiet relationships, a handshake with a local union head, a private talk with a project manager. Over time, those connections hardened into a system. Contractors who wanted big jobs, office towers, city projects, bridges, had to think not only about their bid prices and engineering plans, but also about who controlled the unions they would need. If the word went out that a certain company was okay, things ran smoothly. Workers showed up as scheduled. Deliveries arrived without delay. If the word went out that a firm was not cooperating with the right people, problems stacked up. In some cases, developers were told, through intermediaries, that they needed to use a specific set of subcontractors and suppliers if they wanted to avoid headaches. This loose alliance of favored companies, protected by the family, later became known in law enforcement circles as a club controlling much of the concrete work in parts of New York. The companies paid tribute upward for this protection and privileged access. In return, they received help steering contracts, discouraging competition, and making sure labor remained calm. Frank's name appeared again and again in FBI memos that described this arrangement. Witnesses said he attended meetings where territories were divided, jobs allotted, and prices quietly fixed so that bids would look competitive on paper while still returning profit to the same core circle. Business owners who tried to undercut those prices, without permission, found themselves frozen out by unions or facing endless, unforeseen problems on their sites. It wasn't just about money from the projects themselves. Once control over a union or trade group was established, there were other sources of income. Kickbacks from benefit funds, for instance. Pensions and health plans meant to support workers became tempting targets. Officials friendly to the family sometimes diverted loans or investments from these funds to ventures tied to criminals, often with terrible results down the line when the money failed to come back. While no record shows Frank personally pocketing pension cash, later government analyses of Genovese's activities in the building trades suggest that leaders like him either knew of or tolerated such schemes as part of the broader exploitation of labor institutions. To them, these funds were just another pot on the stove. Violence hung behind all of this like a shadow. The files read by the trainee in that basement room spoke of assault cases with reluctant witnesses, businesses torched after refusing demands, and sudden disappearances never fully solved. The reports rarely named him as the man who gave a direct order in any particular case. That was part of how the hierarchy protected itself. Still, agents and prosecutors came to believe that nothing major occurred in territories he oversaw without at least his awareness, if not his approval. One memo summarized it bluntly. Subject is believed to authorize use of intimidation and physical force when necessary to maintain control over gambling, loan, and labor operations. No crime scene details followed in that trimmed-down line, but behind it lay broken bones, destroyed property, and at times, deaths that family members mourned as accidents, while whispering a different story at kitchen tables. Alongside these darker threads ran something that complicated the picture: moments of generosity and old-world loyalty. People from his neighborhood later recalled him quietly paying for funerals when a wage earner died, slipping money to widows, covering medical bills for extended family. Shopkeepers who never crossed his organization's interests sometimes found him to be a steady customer, praising their food, passing along compliments. In those limited roles, away from business, he looked like many other Italian-American elders, family-centered, proud of his immigrant journey, attached to certain traditions. That duality, harm as part of his professional life, kindness in private, still puzzles people looking back. A retired agent once told a journalist, "He could be soft-spoken and polite, but don't let that fool you." The structure he sat in brought real damage. You can be a doting grandfather and still oversee something that hurts a lot of people. The trainee reading his file felt that tension. On one page, a grandchild described him as gentle. On another, a contractor painted him as the invisible hand that had crushed an honest business. Both accounts were true in their own way, reflecting different sides of a man formed by a harsh time and an unforgiving path. One chapter of the binder focused on a specific investigation in the late 1970s. It traced the story of a mid-sized contractor who had refused to join the quiet cartel shaping concrete jobs. At first, the company simply lost bids it thought it should have won. Then came pickets that shut down sites, filed by unions suddenly at odds with working conditions they had previously accepted. After that, equipment started to be vandalized at night. Insurance costs climbed. Deadlines were missed, clients grew nervous. Finally, the contractor received a message from an intermediary, meet for coffee. At that meeting, held in a modest restaurant, he was told that he had been making things difficult. There was a simple solution, the go-between said. Agree to limit bids to smaller jobs, leave the big ones to the club, and accept certain suppliers on the work he kept. If he did so, the problems would disappear. If not, they might get worse. That contractor eventually cooperated with investigators, helping them understand how such pressure was applied without open threats. The go-between never mentioned Frank's name, but surveillance reports placed one of Frank's close associates at a table in the back that same day, arriving early, leaving late. To detectives, it fit a long pattern. He stayed 1 or 2 steps back from the visible conversations while making sure his chosen lieutenants carried out the line he wanted held. The trainee closed the binder for a moment and rubbed his eyes. The story was long, tangled, and sometimes tiring, yet he understood why the agency kept teaching it. This was how modern organized crime often worked, not always through spectacular robberies or wild chases, but through steady pressure applied across dozens of lives over many years. Back in his own time, decades earlier, Frank had not thought of himself as a character in some future lesson. He had seen himself, perhaps, as a practical man navigating a hard world, making a living in the system he knew. The laws of that world were unwritten but clear. Loyalty up, money up, silence always. People paid, schemes succeeded, other men fell, he rose. That was the rhythm. What he did not fully grasp, or chose not to see, was the growing determination on the other side. By the time he sat in that courtroom, the patience of the larger society had worn thin. Voters wanted safer streets and cleaner unions. Politicians wanted headlines showing progress. Agents and prosecutors, many motivated by families who had lived through the Depression and war, saw in his case a chance to prove that no one, no matter how careful, was beyond the reach of the law. The trainee in the basement room turned to the last pages of the binder, which listed the official charges that stuck. Racketeering under RICO, based on a pattern of illegal gambling, extortion, and labor bribery. Specific counts tied to managing betting operations. Conspiracy to extort businesses through threats and misuse of union power. Contempt related to an earlier refusal to cooperate with a grand jury. There were mentions of earlier arrests and charges that hadn't led to long time. Old gambling cases, bookmaking counts, possession of betting records. Taken alone, each seemed manageable. Taken together, they drew a map of a life lived around crime. On the final sheet, a supervisor had written a short note for trainees. Important, do not romanticize. Study the methods, not the man. Remember the people whose names do not appear here, the ones who paid, who suffered, who had fewer choices. That is the real measure of what this file describes. The young agent closed the binder and looked up. Somewhere miles away in New York, tower cranes swung above new buildings. A skyline still rising over the water that had first brought a poor boy from Italy to America. Many of those buildings stood on foundations poured during the years when Frank's circle quietly skimmed concrete money. The city had grown despite, and partly through, the under-the-table deals he helped foster. Understanding that tangle, how ambition, opportunity, law, and crime had wrapped around each other in his life, would take more than one training session. It had taken him an entire lifetime to build. It would take many more years for others to fully untangle. In another city, on another day, a different kind of room carried his name. It was a classroom, not a courtroom. Students sat at long tables, notebooks open, laptops glowing faintly. On the board, in neat handwriting, the professor had written, United States v. Tieri, 1980-81. RICO, leadership liability, labor racketeering. Most of the people in that room had never known a world without racketeering laws, wiretaps, and long trials against mob bosses. To them, the idea that figures like Frank, Funzi, Tieri had once seemed almost beyond the reach of the law felt distant, like something out of a documentary. Yet the professor reminded them that only a few decades separated their present from his era. When we talk about him, the professor said, strip away the legend. Focus on what we can prove. Look at the record. The record, once scattered in police basements and FBI file cabinets, had been pulled together over time. Arrest sheets, transcripts, surveillance summaries, informant reports, court opinions. When you laid those pages side by side, patterns stood out. From his early years as a runner around backroom games, he moved into supervising illegal betting in parts of New York. Over the decades, law enforcement documents connected him too. long-standing gambling operations, off-track horse betting, card games, numbers rackets, and sports wagers run outside any legal system. Underground lending at crushing rates, with collections enforced through intimidation, and at times, physical harm carried out by subordinates. Systematic pressure on small and medium-sized businesses, who paid regular fees to avoid damage to property, harassment, or union trouble. Deep involvement in manipulating labor unions and construction trades so that certain companies, tied to the Genovese circle, could dominate contracts, especially in concrete and related work. He did not invent these crimes. They existed before him and continued after him, but his life showed how a person could move from the edges of such activity into a place where threads from all of them ran through his hands. One thing still debated years later was his exact position inside the Genovese structure. Law enforcement agencies at the time of his trial saw him as the street boss, the man they could point to as head of the family after the death or imprisonment of earlier leaders. They described him as boss of bosses in some press conferences and reports, meaning not that he ruled every family, but that other New York groups treated him as a senior peer. Later, some informants and historians argued that he had been more of a front boss, a public face meant to take the heat, while more secretive figures quietly set long-term policy. In their version, he was powerful but not the final authority. Both views agreed on one point. He was among the small circle of men who sat near the top, close enough to shape how money moved, which rackets were protected, and how disputes were settled across territories. Those disputes were rarely clean. When bookmakers argued over who could operate on certain blocks, when loan collectors clashed over which debts belonged to which crew, when construction interests tried to break into areas claimed by other families, someone had to mediate. Investigators believed that Frank often filled that role for his side of the underworld. His word, quietly given, could stop a feud or turn it into a confrontation. The professor in that classroom underlined one phrase on the board: pattern of conduct. Think about him not as a single act, she told the students, but as a long series of choices. When you followed those choices through the years, you saw the same kinds of wrongdoing repeated. A bookmaker paying up, month after month, because the alternative was unthinkable. A small retailer handing over cash in the back of a store every Friday, just to keep windows intact and deliveries on time. A contractor agreeing to buy concrete only from designated plants, even when prices were higher, because stepping outside that circle meant problems. A union officer, scared of being pushed out or worse, backing a candidate for leadership he knew was tied to the family, in return for safety and a cut. These were the building blocks of his working life. None of them played out like scenes from a movie. They unfolded in plain clothes, over cheap coffee on ordinary streets. In the neighborhoods where he operated, people developed a way of talking about him without talking about him. They might say, the people upstairs, or our friends, or simply nod when someone mentioned them. Children growing up on those blocks noticed certain men always had good suits and never seemed rushed, but they learned early not to ask too many questions. When his arrest and RICO indictment finally came, that code of silence was tested. A few people broke, sometimes because they faced their own charges, sometimes because they were simply tired of being squeezed. Their statements filled many pages of the record students now studied. One former gambler described how his small operation had been taken over bit by bit. First came a reasonable demand, a small share of profits in exchange for protection from rivals. Over time, the share grew and requests became orders. Refusing meant dealing not only with competition, but with men backed by an entire family structure. When that gambler finally spoke to investigators, he named people he had paid for years. At the top of his list of recipients, he had been told to respect stood Frank's name. Another witness, a construction manager, outlined how certain companies effectively became untouchable in bidding processes. He talked about being told indirectly that if he wanted his job to go smoothly, he would award a key piece of work to a particular firm, known in industry circles to be protected. If he did not, there might be walkouts, delays in deliveries, sudden accidents. He took the hint. When he looked back years later, testifying under oath, he saw those decisions not as savvy business, but as moments when he had given in, little by little, to an invisible system enforced by men he never met in person but whose influence loomed large. When those students raised their hands with questions about how such a system could go on for so long, the professor pointed them back to the slow, steady way Frank had operated. He avoided flash, she said. He didn't draw cameras on purpose. He didn't run around robbed banks or hijack trucks in front of witnesses. He sat in the middle of a web and let others do the work. That's why it took so long to build a case. After his conviction and death, that lesson spread quickly among remaining leaders in other families. They watched how RICO had been used against him and adjusted. Some tried to create more layers between themselves and day-to-day rackets. They relied on acting bosses, or street bosses, to shield the men at the very top. Others bought into more legitimate businesses, using them to launder proceeds and provide a public role that made it easier to deny involvement in crime. Still others tried to narrow their exposure by sticking to fewer categories of activity, hopping that would make it harder for prosecutors to prove the kind of widespread pattern shown in his case. At the same time, his story influenced how government fought organized crime. Before his trial, many prosecutors had thought mainly in terms of single cases, one extortion, one robbery, one bribery incident. Afterwards, more offices began to assemble long-running files that pulled together many incidents over many years, just as had been done with him. One retired agent later said in an interview, "After Tieri, we stopped thinking of them as just individual crooks and really started treating them as what they were, long-term criminal businesses." His case pushed that shift. Outside legal circles, his life also attracted attention. Journalists wrote books that mentioned him in chapters about the Genovese rise. Some television reporters revisited his trial footage in anniversary shows about the mob. In those tellings, he sometimes appeared as a symbol of old-time organized crime, a quiet, serious man from the immigrant generation who ran things in the shadows. Yet for families who had lived under that shadow, there was nothing romantic about it. One small business owner recalled, years after his death, how the weekly envelope she had to fill had forced her to let go of a trusted employee. That worker had done nothing wrong. The pay simply couldn't stretch to cover both wages and the protection money. When she told that story to a local reporter, she never mentioned his name. She just said, "They took from us. That's what I remember." Another man, a retired laborer, talked about the pension he had counted on from his union, only to learn in middle age that the fund had been badly mismanaged, with chunks of money lost to questionable investments and loans. No one could trace any one decision directly back to Frank, but the overall pattern of leaders more interested in pleasing mob-connected higher-ups than in guarding workers' futures matched the kind of influence described in cases tied to his circle. For his own family, the legacy was complicated. Some relatives carried his surname and the weight it brought. Neighbors and classmates would whisper, ask whether they were related to that guy. A few embraced the story, seeing it as a twisted kind of fame. Others tried to step away, changing how they introduced themselves, keeping distance from memories they had never asked to inherit. They knew him as more than a case file. To them, he was the man who sat at the head of the holiday table, who held bobbies, who told stories about the old country and the early days in New York before he was important. They remembered him helping with school fees, slipping money into envelopes for weddings, insisting on certain values at home, respect for elders, loyalty to kin, keeping private matters inside the family. They also knew, even if no one said it flatly, that the source of that money and that authority was a life in organized crime. Some drew a hard line in their minds. That was his world, not mine. Others wrestled with quieter questions. What it meant to love someone who had caused so much unseen harm to people outside the family circle. Whether you could honor parts of a person's character while firmly rejecting what they had done for a living. Historians, looking back from a distance, tried to keep their footing between those views. They saw him as one thread in a larger tapestry of 20th century American life. The immigrant experience, urban poverty, the growth of unions, the building booms that reshaped cities, the long struggle between law enforcement and underground groups that tried to profit from every shift. In that tapestry, his crimes were clear enough. He spent his adult years involved in illegal gambling on a large scale, loan sharking that trapped borrowers in cycles of fear and debt, coordinated pressure and threats against shops, contractors, and other businesses to compel regular payments, and exploitation of labor institutions, using unions not to help workers, but to extract money and control from employers and honest union members alike. Sometimes, violence backed those activities. Beatings, destruction of property, and in some cases, killings within the broader world he lived in helped keep people compliant. Though courts never pinned specific acts of lethal violence directly on him, law enforcement summaries made plain that such force was part of the toolkit available to his organization, used to protect the revenue streams his position depended on. What made his case particularly important, the professor told her students, was not that he had done something completely new, but that the system finally found a way to hold someone at his level legally responsible for a long chain of coordinated wrongdoing. Before him, she said, we often only clipped off the branches. That trial went after part of the trunk. Outside, beyond the classroom windows, students left the building and stepped into a city that bore no obvious sign of Frank's hand. The social clubs he had once frequented had changed names, become coffee shops or apartments. Many of the men he had worked with were dead, imprisoned, or retired into quiet corners. New kinds of organized crime had risen. Cyber fraud, international trafficking networks, schemes that moved money across borders with a click instead of an envelope. Yet the lessons drawn from his life still shaped how people thought about those new threats. The idea of looking for patterns, of treating a set of acts as the work of a coordinated enterprise rather than as separate crimes, came directly from the way prosecutors had built their case against him. In the end, that may have been his most enduring place in history, not as the most violent boss, nor the richest, nor even the most famous, but as one of the first whose carefully built underworld career was laid out in court as a single, continuous story. A story of how steady, organized wrongdoing, unchecked, could twist parts of a great city to serve the needs of a very small group of men. On a summer evening many years after he was gone, the old neighborhood looked almost ordinary. Kids rode bicycles in a slow circle around the block. A delivery driver double-parked, hustled a stack of pizza boxes inside, and pulled away again. The social club on the corner had changed its sign. Now it was a bland coffee shop with a few tired plants in the window. People passed without glancing twice. On a bench across the street, a man in his 70s watched the scene and thought about how different it felt from the days when a certain quiet figure could tilt the whole block with a single decision. He had known Frank Funzi, Tieri, when they were both young, had seen him go from envelope-carrying kid to the sort of man nobody argued with. Most of the children zooming past on their bikes had never heard that name. If they had, it was as a line in a documentary, a footnote in someone else's story. But to people of that older generation, his life still hovered over the streets, a reminder of what had once walked there in the open. The bench sitter remembered the beginning, the small Italian boy off the boat, the cramped apartments, the decades when immigrants with heavy accents took the hardest jobs in the loudest factories. He remembered the first whispers that the kid called Francesco was running errands for tough men. Back then, it did not seem like the start of something grand, just another boy finding a way to bring home money in a city that ground people down. Step by step, that path had hardened. What began as carrying messages and watching street corners grew into supervising betting sheets, collecting money from shopkeepers for protection, and making sure nobody opened a card game without permission. Over time, Frank learned where fear lived in people and how to press just hard enough to get what his bosses wanted while usually stopping short of attention-grabbing disaster. By midlife, he was no longer simply part of the machinery. He was one of the men who decided how it would run. He didn't shout in public, he didn't dress loud. He sat at small tables and listened, money from back room. Wagers flowed upward through the system he helped manage. People who had borrowed at impossible rates when banks turned their backs spent years scrambling to stay ahead of the collectors he sent. Contractors who refused to work with companies tied to his circle found unions suddenly uncooperative and projects mysteriously plagued by delay and trouble. To the bench sitter remembering it all, none of this had ever looked glamorous. He had seen store owners counting out cash with hands that trembled, knowing that missing a payment could mean broken glass, smashed equipment, or worse. He had watched decent men passed over for union jobs because they wouldn't bend to the wishes of officers beholden to people like Frank. He had heard stories of beatings, of accidents that no one believed were accidents, of neighbors who packed up and left without a word after refusing an offer they were foolish enough to think they could ignore. That harm never made as much noise as the myths. Movies and novels turned mobsters into tragic figures, half heroes and half villains. But on his street, the reality had been more ordinary and more cruel. The weekly envelope a small cafe had to hand over meant one less worker on the payroll, cheaper ingredients, longer hours for the owner. The high-interest cash forced on a struggling store kept that business barely afloat until it finally sank, leaving a darkened window where light had once glowed. Those were the kinds of ripples created by the man who would eventually sit near the top of the Genovese family structure. By the time the law caught up to him in his 70s, the web he had helped spin reached into a lot of corners. Unsanctioned betting, quiet insurance schemes against trouble, power over hearing in some trades, influence over which companies got major concrete contracts. Federal agents had spent years writing his name into reports, following his associates, and tracking the money that moved through hands beneath his. When they finally brought him into court under the racketeering law, all that history, spread across decades, rose up. Witnesses talked about paying his people so they could keep taking bets. Borrowers described the dread of seeing his collectors on their doorstep. Union officials admitted being leaned on to follow the wishes of his circle. Contractors explained how they had been pushed into sharing out jobs in ways that left honest competition little chance. The law did not need to prove that he had ever swung a bat himself or uttered a direct threat in front of witnesses. It only had to show that he belonged to and played a guiding role in an ongoing enterprise built around repeated crimes, underground betting, predatory lending, pressure on businesses, and misuse of labor power. The jury believed it had. Once the judge imposed a long sentence, the life he had built in the city's shadows ended in that distant prison hospital. His death in custody closed the book on any further charges. There would be no new indictments with his name, no more cross-examinations in courtrooms with reporters waiting outside. Yet his story did not stop there. It just moved into other hands. Agents used his case as a training tool, showing new investigators how to connect small incidents into a big picture, how to follow money instead of just chasing street-level arrests. Prosecutors cited his conviction as proof that the RICO statute could reach high into a crime family's leadership. His name appeared in law review articles about how far responsibility should extend in a criminal organization, how much a person at the top ought to answer for the acts of those below. Later, when the government mounted even larger cases against the National Leadership Council of the New York families, lawyers on both sides mentioned him. The prosecution said, in effect, "Look, we did this before with Tieri, we can do it on a bigger scale." Defense attorneys tried to carve differences. "Our clients aren't the same as that man. The evidence here is thinner." On the other side of the law, mob figures followed his fate just as closely. They took note that a man who had avoided big prison terms for most of his life had finally been boxed in, not by one dramatic crime, but by the picture drawn from many smaller ones. Some tried to adjust. They pushed themselves further from day-to-day rackets, used more cutouts and buffers, or shifted emphasis to crimes they thought would be harder to tie into a long-running pattern. None of that erased what Frank had already done. By the time his heart gave out in that federal clinic, the damage was long since baked into the lives of people he had never met. Workers whose pensions were undermined, families forced out of businesses they loved, neighborhoods where the loudest voice belonged to men who had never been elected to anything. At the same time, his path could not be blamed on circumstance alone. It was true that he had arrived in America with little, that the city of his youth was harsh to newcomers, that discrimination and limited opportunities pushed many toward shortcuts and side hustles. It was also true that thousands of immigrants in the same blocks chose different routes: factory shifts, small legitimate shops, cab driving, tailoring, building families that stayed clear of the underworld. He was not pushed into crime by fate. He walked into it, step by step, helped by older men who saw his willingness and by a system that, for a long time, did not know how to hold someone like him accountable. Once inside, he embraced that world's code: loyalty inward, silence outward, and a readiness to use pressure and fear as tools of business. When people look back from the safety of distance, they sometimes ask what he thought about in those last years, alone with his machines and his paperwork. Only he would have known. There is no recorded confession, no late life statement of remorse, no secret diary. All that remains are the outer facts: the childhood in a small Italian town, the ship to New York, the rise through the Genovese ranks, the years of running, betting, and protection schemes, the influence over unions and construction, the racketeering trial, the conviction, the quiet death behind thick walls. What can be drawn from that, with some fairness, are the lessons for people who never met him. One is that crime at his level is rarely about single explosions of violence. It is about long trends, a few dollars taken from many pockets again and again, until fortunes build on the backs of people with far fewer choices. It is about systems, unions, industries, neighborhoods, bent away from their original purpose to feed private interests. Another is that law can change the balance, but slowly. For much of his life, the rules and tools available to investigators made it hard to reach insulated leaders. Raids hit the fringe workers. Fines stung but did not stop. Only when statutes like RICO allowed prosecutors to treat the family as an enterprise and argue a pattern of wrongdoing did the law finally extend high enough to catch him. His case showed that shift in action. A third is more personal, that the same person can hold care and cruelty, affection and exploitation in different compartments. The grandfather at the holiday table may also be the man whose decisions have emptied other families' cupboards. Loving him as kin does not cancel what his public life did to strangers. Condemning his crimes does not erase the reality that someone, somewhere, grieved him. For the children listening to bedtime stories about old New York, these nuances might be too tangled at first. They hear simpler versions. There was a poor boy who became powerful in the wrong way. His choices hurt many people. In the end, the law caught up with him, and he died far from home. It sounds almost like a cautionary fable. Underneath that, for older ears, lies the more detailed truth. He leaned on wagers that should have been harmless fun, turned unions meant to protect into levers, made fear a business expense. He moved through his city as both neighbor and predator, offering a kind of rough order in some situations while feeding off the vulnerability of others. He lived long enough to see the tools of his trade become the very lines of evidence that undid him. On that bench across from the coffee shop where the social club used to be, the man who remembered it all finally stood to go home. The streetlights blinked on, washing the block in yellow. A bus roared past, full of commuters scrolling through glowing screens, heading back to apartments where the name Frank Tieri meant nothing. Maybe that forgetting was a kind of blessing. Maybe it was also a risk. Because if his story fades entirely, the patterns he embodied might become easier to repeat in new forms, not through smoky card rooms and cement scams, but through keyboards, shells of companies, or schemes that twist new institutions instead of unions and construction crews. That is why, in training rooms and classrooms, people still speak his name, not to glamorize him, but to keep the memory of the pattern alive, to remind themselves that behind every tall building, every busy shop, every paycheck, there can be unseen hands trying to bend things for their own gain, and that those hands, no matter how steady they seem, belong to people who can be traced, tried, and in the end, reduced to the same few lines on a grave marker as anyone else. So the tale ends with a simple image: a boy stepping off a ship, eyes wide at the sight of New York, an old man in a hospital bed listening to machines. Between those 2 points stretch years of choices, some clever, many harmful, all real. The city he walked in is still there, changed and unchanged. Its streets hold countless other stories, of workers who built, of families who struggled honestly, of officers and lawyers who spent their careers pushing back against the kind of power he wielded. Set against that wider crowd, his life becomes what it always was at its core: one human path among millions, a warning about where certain roads lead when you follow them long enough and refuse until it's too late to turn aside. And as the night settles once more over the silent empires, we step away from the quiet, enduring world of Frank "Funzi" Tieri, a man who proved that survival often belongs to those who speak the least and watch the longest. His story fades gently into the darkness, carried by patience, tradition, and a lifetime lived in the shadows. If this story helped you relax or drift toward sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these soft-spoken stories alive. Now let your breathing slow, let the silence take over, and allow the echoes of history to guide you gently into rest. Good night.